Imagine yourself in a place so dark, so quiet, that you can hear your own heartbeat. No voices, no land, no rescue. Just the cold silence of the deep sea and the crushing pressure of the water pressing on your body from every direction. Now imagine you're stuck there, 100 meters beneath the ocean's surface, cut off from the world above. No signals, no oxygen lines, and only 10 minutes of air left in your tank. This is where the story begins. This is Last Breath, a terrifying, real-life survival tale that pushes the limits of human endurance, technology, and the unknown force of the deep. Let me tell you the story of Chris Lemons, a professional saturation diver who found himself face-to-face with death, alone at the bottom of the North Sea. Chris wasn't just any diver. He was part of an elite, highly trained group of workers known as saturation divers. These men live and work in extreme environments most people will never even imagine. Their job? To repair and maintain deep-sea pipelines, mostly oil and gas infrastructure, sometimes more than 90 meters under the sea. At that depth, if you tried to surface quickly without proper decompression, your lungs would collapse. Your blood would boil. To prevent that, saturation divers live in hyperbaric chambers for weeks at a time. These chambers mimic the intense pressure of the ocean floor. And when it's time to work, they're lowered into the sea in a steel pod called a diving bell. Think of it like an underwater spaceship. Inside they carry tools, cameras, and their lives are connected to the surface by a single vital cord, called the umbilical. It provides light, air, and communication. Chris was part of a three-man team. Alongside him was David Uasa, an experienced diver and calm professional. And up in the diving bell was Duncan Alcock, the supervisor in charge of keeping everything running smoothly. Their ship, the Topaz, floated in the freezing waters of the North Sea. That day's mission, a standard inspection and maintenance job on a gas pipeline. Everything was routine. The divers descended in the bell. David and Chris stepped out into the dark. Their helmets lit a narrow path through the murky waters, each movement deliberate, every breath counted. They walked on the seabed like astronauts on the moon. Slow, careful, trained. They were tethered to the bell by their umbilicals, cables that supplied everything essential for survival. But then, something started to go wrong. As Chris and David worked below, something critical happened on the surface. The ship's dynamic positioning system, known as the DPS, suddenly failed. Now this system is not just a fancy GPS. It's what keeps the ship perfectly still despite waves, wind, and currents. Without it, the Topaz began to drift. And when the ship moves, everything connected to it moves too. That includes the diving bell. That includes the umbilical cables. That includes Chris and David. Suddenly the diving bell began pulling away, drifting. Chris and David, still outside on the seabed, were now in danger of being dragged or left behind. David quickly started moving toward the bell. He reached it just in time. Chris wasn't so lucky. His umbilical got caught, snagged on a piece of underwater structure. And then, the unthinkable happened. The umbilical snapped. In an instant, Chris lost his oxygen supply, helmet lights, heating system, communication line, and even his connection to the ship's tracking system. Now, Chris Lemons was completely alone, in total darkness, 100 meters underwater. He had only one thing left, a small emergency tank of oxygen strapped to his back, designed to last just 10 minutes. 10 minutes but to be found, or to die. Chris knew the rules. Panic would only make things worse. Hyperventilating would burn through his air faster. So, he stayed calm. Every step he took on the seabed had to be careful. Visibility, less than a few feet. The world around him was pitch black, and the cold, nearly freezing, began seeping into his body. Meanwhile, up above in the bell, Duncan was trying to stay calm too. David had made it back safely, but he didn't know what had happened to Chris. Above the surface, the crew was desperately trying to recover from the DPS failure. Dropping anchor wasn't an option. It could damage the gas pipelines below. Instead, the team manually operated the ship's thrusters to stabilize the vessel while rebooting the DPS system. They launched the ROV to search for Chris. Amazingly, the ROV located him, still alive but unconscious and showing clear signs of severe oxygen deprivation. They tried to retrieve him using the ROV, but it failed. Chris had tied himself to the manifold to avoid being swept away. The only way to reach him was to go back down. Once the DPS rebooted and the ship stabilized, they positioned the diving bell back near the worksite. Dave suited up again and descended into the black waters. He found Chris's lifeless body still tied to the manifold. It had been 29 minutes since his umbilical was severed, far beyond what any diver could normally survive. Dave carried Chris back to the bell. Inside, Duncan performed mouth-to-mouth resuscitation and CPR. Then, against all odds, Chris began to breathe again. At first, he was unresponsive, his body limp and his pupils dilated. They feared he had suffered severe brain damage due to hypoxia, but just as hope began to fade, Chris spoke. He was back. The dive rotation was canceled. Chris began his recovery in the ship's decompression chamber during the long journey back to port. Upon arrival, he said goodbye to Duncan and Dave, then returned home, into the arms of his fiancée. 3 weeks later, Chris, Dave, and Duncan returned to the North Sea, to the same job, at the same depth, in the same unforgiving ocean. In the final moments, the film reveals that Chris suffered no lasting physical or mental damage from the incident. Medical experts couldn't explain how he survived, because the mission wasn't finished, because diving was his life, and because sometimes surviving isn't the end of the story. It's just the beginning. Behind the gripping story of a diver trapped alone at the bottom of the ocean, Last Breath isn't just a tale of survival. It's a reflection of human strength, unshakable resolve, and the true meaning of hope. This film teaches us that life can change in an instant. One moment you're safe, in control, focused on your work. And the next, you're completely cut off. No light, no signal, no rescue. In that moment, all that remains is your will to live. Chris Lemons faced the unthinkable. Severed from his air supply, submerged 100 meters below the surface with only 10 minutes of emergency oxygen. In that kind of darkness, many would panic. Many would give up. But Chris didn't. He stayed calm. He didn't let fear control him. And that simple act of holding on when everything around you says to let go is what makes this story so powerful. Because sometimes life will take you into darkness. You'll feel alone, hopeless, like time is running out. But this film reminds us that even when you can't see a way out, there might still be one, as long as you don't give up. Last Breath also shows us the power of trust and teamwork. Chris wasn't saved by luck alone. He was saved by his crewmates, Dave and Duncan, who refused to stop searching, who risked everything to bring him back, who believed there was still a chance, even when logic said otherwise. This story moves us because it's real. It's not fiction. It's not CGI. It's the story of a real man who came face to face with death and lived. The message is simple, yet profound. Never underestimate the power of one last breath. Because sometimes, that breath isn't the end. It's the beginning.